The ruins stand on a hill above the plain, golden in the afternoon light. The stones are massive, ancient beyond easy comprehension, fitted together with a precision that defies the passage of more than 3,000 years. This is Mycenae, citadel of legends, fortress of kings, the place where Greek civilization first took recognizable shape in the deep Bronze Age. The Lion Gate rises before you, two great carved lions flanking a central column, their heads now lost to time but their bodies still powerful, still watchful. You pass beneath them and enter a world that existed long before Athens, long before democracy or philosophy, or the tragedies of Sophocles, a world of warrior kings and palatial halls, of linear B tablets and golden death masks, of bronze weapons and careful accounting of sheep and chariots and offerings to gods whose names we still recognize today. The wind moves across the hilltop, carrying with it the scent of wild herbs and dry grass. Below, the Argolid plain stretches away toward distant mountains, a landscape of olive groves and scattered farms, much as it might have looked in antiquity, though the palaces that once commanded these valleys are long gone, reduced to foundations and tumbled walls. Mycenae itself is a ruin, but a ruin that still speaks. The great circuit walls, built from stones so large that later Greeks believed they must have been placed by the Cyclopes, still encircle the summit. The tomb known as the Treasury of Atreus, a beehive-shaped chamber cut into the hillside below the citadel, still stands intact, its corbelled dome, a masterpiece of Bronze Age engineering. And everywhere in the museum nearby are the artifacts, pottery painted with octopi and chariots, bronze daggers inlaid with gold, seal stones carved with images of lions and griffins, and above all those astonishing gold masks, hammered to fit the faces of long-dead kings, their features preserved in metal as their flesh and bone dissolved into the earth. To stand here is to stand at the beginning of something vast and consequential. The Mycenaeans were not the first people to live in Greece. Farmers had worked these valleys for thousands of years before them, and the great Minoan civilization of Crete had already risen to splendor by the time the first Greek-speaking peoples arrived on the mainland. But the Mycenaeans were the first Greeks, the first people in this land to speak the language that would become the language of Homer and Pericles, of Plato and Alexander. They were the first to write Greek, scratching syllabic signs onto clay tablets, to record the mundane business of palace administration, quantities of grain and oil, lists of offerings to the gods, inventories of weapons and chariots. They built the first Greek kingdoms, small and fiercely competitive, centered on fortified hilltop palaces, where warrior elites ruled over territories measured in days of travel rather than modern miles. And when their world collapsed around 1200 BC, swept away in the great catastrophe that ended the Bronze Age across the eastern Mediterranean, the memory of what they had been lingered on in oral tradition, eventually crystallizing into the myths and epics that the later Greeks would recognize as the stories of their own heroic past. The Mycenaean age was brief, as these things are measured, perhaps 600 or 700 years, from the first stirrings of what we can recognize as distinctively Mycenaean culture around 1750 BC, to the final collapse around 1050 BC. But in that span of time, a civilization rose from relative obscurity to become one of the great powers of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Mycenaean traders and warriors ventured across the Aegean to Crete and the Cycladic Islands, to the coast of Anatolia and the Levant, to Egypt and perhaps even to the western Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery has been found in sites from Italy to the Near East, evidence of a far-flung network of exchange. The palaces accumulated wealth in the form of gold and bronze, fine textiles and perfumed oils, ivory and amber from distant lands. And at the height of their power, around 1300 BC, the Mycenaeans may have mounted the expedition that later generations would remember as the Trojan War, the great alliance of Greek kings sailing east to besiege a wealthy city on the coast of Anatolia, a war that would echo through literature and imagination for millennia to come. But the Mycenaeans left no literature of their own, no epic poems or historical chronicles. The linear B tablets, when they were finally deciphered in 1952, turned out to contain only the driest of administrative records, lists and inventories, religious offerings and personnel rosters, the paperwork of palace bureaucracy. Everything else we know about the Mycenaeans comes from archaeology, from the ruins of their palaces and tombs, from the objects they made and traded, from the frescoes that once adorned their walls and the bones buried in their graves, and from the myths, of course, those extraordinary stories that the later Greeks told about the age of heroes, stories that preserved, however distorted by centuries of retelling, something of the world that had been. The light is beginning to soften now, the afternoon drawing toward evening. The stones of Mycenae seem to glow in the slanting sun, warm and golden. There is something deeply peaceful about this place. Despite, or perhaps because of its violent history, the warriors who once walked these ramparts are 3,000 years gone. The kings who were buried with gold masks and bronze weapons have long since returned to dust. The scribes who carefully tallied sheep and grain on their clay tablets could not have imagined that their records would survive when nearly everything else their civilization created would perish. And yet here we stand, able to piece together something of their world, to trace the outlines of their lives, to understand at least a little of what it meant to be Mycenae in the late Bronze Age. This is a story told in fragments and silences, in the gaps between what we can know and what we can only imagine. It is a story of beginnings, of the first Greek kingdoms, the first Greek writing, the first recognizable ancestors of classical Greek culture. It is a story of ambition and wealth, of warrior elites and maritime trade, of gods whose names are familiar, but whose worship took forms we can barely reconstruct. And it is a story of endings, of a world that flourished for centuries, and then vanished with shocking suddenness, leaving behind only ruins and legends, only the wind moving through empty halls, and the slow, patient work of archaeologists, sifting through the debris of a lost civilization. We begin not with the Mycenaeans themselves, but with the world that existed before they emerged, the world into which the first Greek-speaking peoples came, bearing new languages and new customs, to mingle with and eventually transform the ancient cultures of the Aegean. The land itself is old beyond counting. The mountains of Greece rose from the sea millions of years ago, the product of the same tectonic forces that still shake these lands with earthquakes, that carve the deep valleys and steep hillsides that characterize the Greek landscape. By the time humans arrived, sometime in the deep Paleolithic, the basic geography was already established. The mainland peninsula extending south into the Mediterranean, the long chains of islands stepping across the Aegean toward the coast of Anatolia, Crete, lying like a great stepping stone between Europe and Africa. This is a landscape of stone and sea, of mountains that divide the land into small valleys and coastal plains, each naturally isolated from its neighbors, each a world unto itself. The sea is never far away, visible from nearly every hilltop, a highway connecting the scattered communities more effectively than any road across the rough interior ever could. The first farmers came to Greece around 7000 BC, part of the Great Neolithic Revolution that transformed human life across the Near East and Mediterranean. They brought with them domesticated wheat and barley, sheep and goats, cattle and pigs, and the knowledge of how to make pottery and build permanent houses. The earliest Neolithic settlements in Greece are found in Thessaly and Macedonia. In the Peloponnese and central Greece, small villages of rectangular mud brick houses clustered together, each community numbering perhaps a few dozen or a few hundred people. They grew their crops in the valley bottoms and pastured their animals on the hillsides. They made simple handmade pottery, elegant vessels decorated with painted or incised patterns. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, or in cemeteries outside the settlements. And slowly, over millennia, they spread across the Greek landscape, clearing forests, terracing hillsides, establishing the pattern of small agricultural communities that would persist in one form or another for thousands of years to come. By 3000 BC, as the early Bronze Age began, Greece was dotted with farming villages, some of them growing into more substantial settlements that might be called towns. On the islands of the Aegean, particularly in the Cyclades, a distinctive culture emerged, known today mainly from its striking marble figurines, stylized human forms, mostly female, their arms folded across their chests, their faces blank except for a long nose. These figurines have been found in graves, often accompanying burials, and their exact meaning remains mysterious, though they clearly held some significance, whether religious or social or purely aesthetic, for the people who carved them with such care from the fine white marble of the islands. On Crete, the largest of the Aegean islands, something more ambitious was beginning to take shape. By 2000 BC, the Minoans, named for the legendary King Minos, though we do not know what they called themselves, were building the first palaces at Knossos and Phaistos, great sprawling complexes of courtyards and storerooms, workshops and ceremonial spaces. The Minoan palaces were unlike anything that had come before in the Aegean, evidence of a level of social complexity and centralized organization unprecedented in this part of the world. They were not defensive structures, not fortresses built to withstand siege, but open administrative and ceremonial centers, their walls covered with vivid frescoes showing dolphins and lilies, bull leaping and processions, elegant women in elaborate costumes and bare-chested youths. The Minoans developed their own writing system, a script we call Linear A, still undeciphered, used to keep records much as the later Mycenaeans would use Linear B. They traded widely across the Mediterranean, their distinctive pottery and other goods reaching Egypt and the Levant, Anatolia, and the Western Mediterranean. The Minoan world was a world of maritime commerce, an apparently peaceful prosperity, a thalassocracy, a sea empire, whose influence spread through trade and cultural prestige rather than military conquest. The palaces accumulated wealth in the form of agricultural products, olive oil and wine, grain and wool, stored in massive clay jars in the palace magazines, and luxury goods imported from abroad or crafted by specialized artisans attached to the palace workshops. The Minoans worshipped a variety of deities, some of whom seem to have been goddesses, celebrated in rituals that took place in palace shrines and in sacred caves and mountaintop sanctuaries scattered across the island. They developed sophisticated technologies, techniques for working bronze and gold, systems of plumbing and drainage, methods of fresco painting that produced images of startling beauty and dynamism. For centuries, from roughly 2000 to 1450 BC, Minoan Crete was the most advanced civilization in the Aegean, the cultural and economic heart of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. On the Greek mainland, things were quieter. The early and Middle Bronze Age communities of mainland Greece were smaller and less prosperous than their Minoan counterparts. Village-based societies, with little evidence of centralized authority or monumental architecture. There were regional differences, the settlements of the Argolid and Mycenae, of Boeotia and Attica, each with their own pottery styles and burial customs. But overall, the mainland seems to have been something of a backwater compared to the brilliance of Minoan Crete. And yet it was here, on the mainland, that the transformation would occur that would eventually give rise to the Mycenaean civilization, the first flowering of Greek culture, the seed from which classical Greece would eventually grow. Sometime around 2000 BC, perhaps a bit earlier, perhaps a bit later. The evidence is ambiguous and much debated. The first Greek-speaking peoples arrived in the Aegean. We do not know exactly where they came from, though most theories place their origins somewhere to the north, in the Balkans or the steppes beyond, part of the great migrations of Indo-European speaking peoples that transformed Europe and the Near East in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. We do not know whether they came as conquerors or migrants, whether their arrival was a sudden event, or a gradual infiltration over generations. What we do know is that by the Middle Bronze Age, around 1750 BC, Greek was being spoken in Greece, and a new culture was emerging that would come to dominate the Aegean by the end of the Bronze Age. The evidence for this transformation is subtle and scattered. There is no dramatic break in the archaeological record, no sudden replacement of one culture by another, no obvious horizon of destruction marking the arrival of a new people. Instead, there are gradual changes, shifts in pottery styles, new types of burial, different patterns of settlement, the introduction of new customs and perhaps new technologies. The pottery of the Middle Bronze Age mainland, particularly the style known as minion ware, is quite different from earlier pottery, with its distinctive grey colour and fine wheel-made fabric. Burials become more varied, including both traditional cist graves and a new type of tomb, the shaft grave, which would become the signature burial form of the early Mycenaean elite. Settlements become larger and more complex, and at a few sites, particularly in the Argolid and Mycenae, we begin to see the first signs of social hierarchy, of emerging elites who could command greater resources and display their status through elaborate burials and fine imported goods. The linguistic evidence is equally subtle. Greek belongs to the Indo-European language family, related to Latin and Sanskrit, to Celtic and Germanic, to Hittite and Persian. It is not related to the languages spoken in the ancient Near East, the Semitic languages like Akkadian and Hebrew, or to the mysterious languages of the Minoans and the Etruscans. The Greek language shows signs of having absorbed vocabulary from the pre-Greek languages spoken in the Aegean before the Greeks arrived. Words for plants and places, for features of the landscape, for certain types of pottery and tools. This suggests a period of bilingualism, of interaction between the newcomers and the indigenous peoples, a gradual process of cultural and linguistic fusion, rather than a simple conquest and replacement. Genetic studies of ancient DNA have added another dimension to this picture. Analysis of skeletal remains from Bronze Age Greece shows a mixture of ancestry, some deriving from the Neolithic farming populations that had inhabited Greece for thousands of years, some from populations that arrived later, probably from the Pontic-Caspian steppe via the Balkans. This genetic mixture is consistent with the arrival of Indo-European speakers who intermarried with the local populations, creating over time a new culture that combined elements from both groups. By the late Bronze Age, the populations of Mycenaean Greece were genetically similar to the populations of later classical Greece, suggesting a basic continuity from the Bronze Age to the historical period. So the Greeks arrived, or emerged, or coalesced. The exact mechanism remains unclear, and gradually, over the course of the Middle Bronze Age, a new culture began to take shape. Settlements grew larger and more centralized. Regional elites began to emerge, probably based on control of agricultural land and labor, on the accumulation of wealth through trade and warfare, on the cultivation of networks of loyalty and obligation that bound lesser chiefs and warriors to more powerful lords. And at a few key sites, particularly Mycenae and the Argolid, something extraordinary began to happen, an explosion of wealth and power that would mark the beginning of the Mycenaean age proper. The site of Mycenae occupies a commanding position on a low hill at the northern edge of the Argolid plain, overlooking the routes that lead from the plain toward Corinth and the isthmus to the north. It is not the most obvious place for a major settlement. There are larger and more fertile plains elsewhere in the Argolid, and the hill itself is steep and rocky, difficult to build on, and harder still to supply with water. But it is highly defensible, and it commands the routes between the Argolid and the rest of Greece, making it an ideal location for a power that sought to control both the agricultural wealth of the plain and the trade routes that connected the Peloponnese to the wider world. The earliest occupation at Mycenae goes back to the Neolithic period, and there is evidence of continuous or near-continuous habitation through the early and Middle Bronze Age. But it is in the late Middle Bronze Age, around 1600 BC, that Mycenae suddenly leaps into prominence, and the evidence for this transformation is as dramatic as anything in Bronze Age archaeology. The royal shaft graves, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876, one of the most spectacular archaeological finds of all time. Schliemann came to Mycenae in search of Agamemnon. He believed rightly, as it turned out, though not in the way he imagined, that the world described in Homer's epics had been real, that the heroes of the Trojan War had actually existed, that the palaces and kingdoms of the Iliad were not pure invention but distorted memories of a real Bronze Age civilization. He had already excavated at Troy, in northwestern Anatolia, uncovering multiple layers of ancient settlement and claiming, controversially, to have found the city of Priam. Now he turned his attention to Mycenae, the kingdom of Agamemnon, the greatest of the Greek heroes who sailed to Troy. Guided by the ancient Greek traveler Pausanias, who had visited Mycenae in the 2nd century AD, and described the ruins he found there, Schliemann began excavating inside the Lion Gate, in the area just inside the citadel walls. Almost immediately, he began to find graves, not ordinary graves, but deep rectangular shafts cut into the bedrock, lined with stone walls, and covered with wooden beams and stone slabs. And in those graves, he found treasures beyond imagining: gold and silver vessels, bronze weapons inlaid with gold and silver, and niello, jewelry of exquisite craftsmanship, and most famously, the gold death masks, thin sheets of gold hammered to fit the faces of the dead and placed over their faces in the grave. Schliemann found 6 shaft graves in what became known as Grave Circle A, containing the remains of 19 individuals, men, women, and children, buried with wealth that proclaimed their status as royalty or high nobility. The men were buried with weapons, bronze swords and daggers, spearheads, and the remains of what may have been shields or body armor. The women wore elaborate jewelry, gold diadems and necklaces, rings and bracelets, pins to fasten their clothing. Many of the objects were of extraordinary quality, decorated with intricate designs, scenes of warfare and hunting, images of animals and plants, geometric patterns of great complexity. Some of the objects were clearly imports or made from imported materials: amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa or Syria, ostrich eggs from Egypt or Libya, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The gold alone was staggering. More than 15 kilograms of gold objects were found in Grave Circle A, an amount that speaks to immense accumulated wealth and access to far-flung trade networks. When Schliemann uncovered the gold mask from Schaft Grave Vive, one of the best preserved and most individual of the masks, he famously sent a telegram to the King of Greece. "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." It was not Agamemnon, of course. The graves date to around 1600 BC, far too early for the Trojan War, which, if it happened at all, probably occurred around 1200 BC. But in a deeper sense, Schliemann was right. These were the graves of the early Mycenaean elite, the warrior aristocracy that would eventually give rise to the kingdoms of the Iliad, the ancestors, culturally, if not genetically, of Agamemnon and Achilles and the other heroes of Greek myth. The shaft graves raise as many questions as they answer. Where did this sudden wealth come from? The graves represent an explosive increase in the resources controlled by the Mycenaean elite, far beyond anything seen in earlier periods. Some of the wealth must have come from trade. The Mycenaeans were clearly connected to Mediterranean-wide networks of exchange, importing raw materials and luxury goods from across the known world. Some may have come from warfare and raiding, the accumulation of plunder and tribute extracted from weaker neighbors. And some probably came from the intensification of agricultural production and the more efficient exploitation of local resources, metals from the Lion mines in Attica, agricultural surpluses from the fertile plains of the Argolid and Mycenae, control of trade routes and harbour sites that allowed the Mycenaean elite to tax and profit from the movement of goods. But wealth alone does not explain the shaft graves. These burials are not simply rich, they are theatrical, designed to display status and power, to make visible the extraordinary position of the individuals buried within them. The gold masks in particular serve no practical purpose. They are not meant to be worn in life, only in death, a permanent monument to the identity and status of the deceased. The weapons are often non-functional, ceremonial pieces too elaborate and fragile for actual use, intended to signify the warrior identity of the dead, rather than to equip them for battle. And the sheer quantity of goods placed in the graves, hundreds of objects in some cases, suggests a deliberate effort to consume wealth in burial, to remove valuable goods from circulation, as a demonstration of the surplus resources controlled by the elite. The shaft graves also show clear evidence of Minoan influence. Many of the finest objects, particularly the gold work and the inlaid weapons, are either Minoan imports or made by Minoan craftsmen working for Mycenaean patrons. The techniques used to create these objects, the motifs and designs that decorate them, the very aesthetic that governs their creation, all derive from Minoan Crete. This suggests that the early Mycenaean elite were actively cultivating connections with the Minoans, importing not just objects, but ideas, styles, and technologies. Whether these connections were peaceful, the result of trade and diplomatic exchange, or involved some degree of coercion, perhaps Mycenaean raids on Crete, or the hiring of Minoan craftsmen under conditions of debt or bondage, remains unclear. What is clear is that by 1600 BC, the Mycenaean elite had access to the best that Minoan civilization had to offer, and they were using it to construct and display their own power and status. The shaft graves at Mycenae were not unique. A second grave circle B, was discovered outside the citadel walls in the 1950s, containing earlier and somewhat less wealthy burials dating back to around 1650 BC. Similar shaft graves have been found at other sites in the Argolid and beyond, though none as rich as those at Mycenae. And at other sites, different forms of elite burial were emerging. The tholos tombs, great beehive-shaped chambers, cut into hillsides and approached by long entrance passages, which would become the standard form of royal burial in the later Mycenaean period. The earliest tholos tombs appear around the same time as the latest shaft graves, suggesting a transition in burial practices that may reflect changing conceptions of kingship and the afterlife. By 1500 BC, Mycenae was clearly the dominant power in the Argolid, and probably in the wider Peloponnese. Other centers were rising as well. Tiryns, just a few miles from Mycenae, would become a major palace site in its own right. Pylos in Mycenae was emerging as a significant power in the southwest. Thebes in Boeotia and Athens in Attica were becoming important regional centers. But Mycenae retained a special prominence, perhaps because of its early start, perhaps because of its strategic location, perhaps because of the ambition and ability of its rulers. The later Greeks remembered Mycenae as the kingdom of the Atreides, the house of Atreus, father of Agamemnon and Menelaus, the royal family that led the Greek expedition against Troy. Whether there is any historical basis for this tradition is impossible to say, but the tradition itself is significant. It suggests that Mycenae's preeminence in the late Bronze Age was remembered, however dimly, by the Greeks of later centuries. The period from about 1450 to 1200 BC marks the height of Mycenaean civilization, what archaeologists call the palatial period. This is the age of the great palaces, the fortified citadels that are the most visible and impressive remains of Mycenaean culture. Mycenae itself was rebuilt and expanded, its walls massively enlarged to create the great circuit that still stands today, enclosing not just the summit of the hill, but a substantial area of the slopes as well. The Lion Gate was constructed, probably in the 13th century BC, a monumental entrance framed by massive stone blocks and topped by the famous relief sculpture of the two lions. The oldest monumental sculpture in Europe, a statement of power and permanence that has endured for more than 3,000 years. Inside the citadel, the palace itself occupied the summit, though sadly little remains of it today. Later building and erosion have destroyed most of the palace structures, leaving only foundations and scattered architectural fragments. But we can reconstruct something of what it must have been like, from better preserved palaces at other sites, particularly Pylos and Tiryns. The heart of the palace was the Megaron, a large rectangular hall with a central hearth and a porch, supported by columns. The Megaron was both the throne room and the feasting hall, the ceremonial and political center of the kingdom, where the king, the one ax in Mycenaean Greek, would receive visitors, conduct official business, and feast with his warriors and nobles. The walls of the Megaron were often decorated with frescoes, painted plaster, showing scenes of warfare and hunting, processions and religious rituals, animals and plants and geometric designs. The floors were made of plaster, sometimes painted with designs or paved with stones. Around the Megaron were other rooms and courtyards, storage rooms for weapons and valuable goods, workshops where craftsmen made pottery and metalwork and textiles, shrines where offerings were made to the gods, residential quarters for the royal family and their household. The palace was not just a residence but an administrative center, a place where the business of the kingdom was conducted, where taxes were collected and redistributed, where records were kept and decisions made. And it was a center of production as well, with workshops attached to the palace producing goods for the king and his court, and probably also for export. The palaces were surrounded by substantial fortifications. The walls of Mycenae are the most impressive, built from enormous limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together with remarkable precision. Later Greeks, unable to imagine how such massive stones could have been moved and placed, attributed the construction to the Cyclopes, the mythical one-eyed giants. In fact, the walls were built by Mycenaean labor, probably using ramps and levers and a great deal of human muscle power. The walls average about 6 meters thick, and originally stood perhaps 8 to 10 meters high, with towers and gates at strategic points. They enclosed an area of about 30,000 square meters, large enough to shelter not just the palace and its immediate household, but also a substantial portion of the population of the surrounding area in times of danger. Other Mycenaean palaces were similarly fortified. Tiryns, just 9 kilometers south of Mycenae, had walls even more massive than those of Mycenae, with galleries built into the thickness of the walls and elaborate gateways designed to channel attackers through a series of defended passages. The palace at Tiryns is better preserved than the one at Mycenae, and its Megaron, with its painted floor and reconstructed hearth, gives a vivid impression of what the great halls of the Mycenaean kings must have been like. Pylos, in contrast, was not heavily fortified. Its palace was protected more by its remote location in the southwestern Peloponnese than by massive walls. But it was richly appointed, with elaborate frescoes and a large archive of Linear B tablets that provide invaluable information about the administration and economy of a Mycenaean kingdom. The fortifications raise an obvious question. Why did the Mycenaean palaces need such massive defenses? The walls of Mycenaean Tiryns represent an enormous investment of labor and resources, far more than would be needed to defend against casual raiders or bandits. They suggest a world in which warfare was a constant threat, in which the rulers of each kingdom felt the need to protect themselves not just from external enemies, but perhaps from rivals among the other Mycenaean kingdoms. The Mycenaean world was not a unified state, but a collection of small independent kingdoms, each ruled by its own one axe, each competing with its neighbors for resources, territory, and prestige. The Great Walls may have been as much about displaying power and deterring rivals as about actual defense. The Linear B tablets give us a glimpse into the administration and economy of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Linear B is a syllabic script, derived from the earlier Minoan Linear A but adapted to write Greek. It was discovered at Knossos in Crete by Arthur Evans in 1900, and later at Pylos and Mycenae and other sites on the mainland. But its decipherment remained one of the great puzzles of archaeology, until 1952. When a young British architect named Michael Ventris finally cracked the code and demonstrated that the language of the tablets was an early form of Greek. The tablets themselves are small rectangular pieces of clay, inscribed while still soft with a stylus, and then either deliberately dried or, more often, accidentally baked when the palace is burned. They record the day-to-day business of palace administration, lists of personnel and their duties, inventories of stored goods, records of tribute or taxation collected from subject communities, offerings made to the gods, allocations of raw materials to craftsmen, assignments of land and labor. They are, in short, bureaucratic documents, the paperwork of palace accountants, and they survive only by accident, had the palaces not burned, destroying the palace archives. The tablets would have been discarded once their information was no longer needed, and we would know nothing of their contents. But even as bureaucratic records, the tablets are revealing. They show us a complex, hierarchical society with a high degree of specialization and centralized control. At the top was the one-axe, the king, who controlled substantial amounts of land and resources directly. Below him was a figure called the law-getters, probably a military commander or war leader, who also controlled land and resources. Below them were various officials and administrators, the telestai, who may have been local governors or tax collectors, the basileia, a term that would later come to mean king, but in the Mycenaean period seems to refer to local lords or chiefs, and a host of other officials with titles that are sometimes difficult to translate or understand. The tablets record an economy that was partly redistributive and partly market-based. The palace collected tribute or taxes in the form of agricultural products, grain, wine, olive oil, wool, flax, and raw materials like bronze and hides. It stored these goods in palace magazines and redistributed them to palace dependents, craftsmen, warriors, priests and priestesses, administrators, in the form of rations. But there is also evidence for private landholding and production, for transactions that took place outside the palace system, for a degree of economic activity that was not directly controlled by the palace bureaucracy. The tablets also give us the names of the Mycenaean gods. Zeus and Hera appear, as do Poseidon and Hermes, Dionysus and Athena, Artemis and Ares. Many of the major gods of the later Greek pantheon were already being worshipped in the Mycenaean period, receiving offerings recorded in the tablets, animals for sacrifice, grain and oil, wine and honey, precious objects of gold and ivory. The continuity is striking. These are recognizably the same gods who would be worshipped by the Greeks 1,000 years later, even if the details of their cults and the stories told about them may have changed over the intervening centuries. But the tablets also record gods who do not appear in later Greek religion, or who appear with different names or attributes. There are references to Apotnia, a lady or mistress, who may be a great goddess worshipped under various titles, perhaps a survival of Minoan religious traditions. There are offerings to gods whose names are obscure or uncertain, whose cults may not have survived into the historical period. And there are references to religious festivals and rituals, to processions and sacrifices, to the sacred places where the gods were honored, caves and mountain peaks, springs and groves, shrines within the palaces and temples in the countryside. Religion permeated Mycenaean life, as it did in all ancient societies. The gods were understood to be actively involved in human affairs, requiring constant propitiation through offerings and rituals. The king himself may have had a sacred role, serving as the chief priest or mediator between the human and divine realms. Certainly the palaces had shrines and cult rooms, and the Linear B tablets record substantial offerings made by the palace to the gods. Whether these offerings were made out of genuine piety, or as a form of political theatre, a way for the king to display his wealth and piety, and his special relationship with the divine, is impossible to say. Probably both motivations were at work, as they are in most religious practices. Daily life for most people in Mycenaean Greece was shaped by the rhythms of agriculture. The majority of the population were farmers, living in small villages and hamlets scattered across the landscape, growing grain and tending olive trees and grapevines, keeping sheep and goats and cattle, producing the food and raw materials that sustained the palace economies. The Linear B tablets give us glimpses of this rural world, lists of villages and their populations, records of land holdings and labor obligations, inventories of flocks and herds. But the tablets record only what was visible to the palace bureaucracy, the portion of the economy that was subject to taxation or administrative control. Most of daily life left no trace in the written record. We can reconstruct something of the material conditions of life, from archaeology, from the remains of houses and settlements, from the objects found in domestic contexts, from analysis of plant and animal remains. Most people lived in simple houses, probably 1 or 2 rooms, built of mud brick on stone foundations, with thatched or flat roofs. Furniture would have been minimal, benches or stools, storage chests, perhaps a bed or sleeping platform. Cooking was done over an open hearth, or in a clay oven. Light came from oil lamps or simple torches. Most households would have had a few pottery vessels for cooking and storage, some tools for agricultural work or craft production, and little else in the way of material possessions. Diet was based on the Mediterranean triad of grain, wine, and olive oil, supplemented by legumes, vegetables, fruit, and animal products. Bread made from wheat or barley was a staple, along with porridge or gruel made from grains. Olive oil was used for cooking, lighting, and probably for personal care as well, bathing and anointing the body. Wine was drunk, probably diluted with water, as was the custom in later Greek times. Meat was probably a luxury for most people, reserved for festivals and special occasions, though cheese and milk from sheep and goats would have been more regularly available. Fish and shellfish supplemented the diet in coastal areas, and wild game may have been hunted in the mountains and forests. The landscape itself was different from today. Much of Greece was more heavily forested in the Bronze Age, though deforestation was already underway, particularly in areas close to major settlements where wood was needed for construction, fuel, and shipbuilding. The mountains were probably home to herds of deer and wild goats, and possibly to larger animals like bears and wolves. The coastlines were dotted with settlements, many of them small fishing villages, but also larger ports that served as entrepots for maritime trade. Trade was central to the Mycenaean economy. Mycenaean pottery, particularly the distinctive decorated vessels of the 14th and 13th centuries BC, with their stylized images of octopi and fish, chariots and warriors, plants, and geometric patterns, has been found across the Mediterranean, from Italy and Sicily in the west, to Cyprus and the Levantine coast in the east, and as far south as Egypt. This pottery was probably often a container for other goods, perfumed oils, wine, unguents, but it also served as a trade good in its own right, valued for its quality and its distinctive designs. In return, the Mycenaeans imported raw materials and luxury goods. Metals were particularly important. Copper from Cyprus, tin from sources in Anatolia, or even further afield, gold and silver from various sources. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the primary metal for tools and weapons, and controlling access to the raw materials needed to produce bronze was a key source of power for Mycenaean elites. Other imports included ivory from Africa or Syria, used for inlays and carved objects. Amber from the Baltic, valued for its beauty and rarity. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, a deep blue stone used in jewelry and inlays. Glass, both raw glass that could be reworked and finished vessels, and exotic materials, like ostrich eggs and hippopotamus teeth. The Mycenaeans also had contacts with their Minoan predecessors and neighbors on Crete. For centuries, the Minoans had been the dominant power in the Aegean, and Mycenaean culture shows strong Minoan influence in many areas: art and architecture, religious practices, administrative systems, even aspects of material culture like pottery and dress. But around 1450 BC, the Minoan palaces suffered a catastrophe. Most of the palaces on Crete were destroyed, and while some, particularly Konos, were reoccupied, the nature of Minoan civilization changed. Linear B tablets appear at Knossos after this date, suggesting that the palace was now under Mycenaean control, or at least that Greek-speaking administrators were keeping the records. Whether this represents a Mycenaean conquest of Crete, a takeover in the wake of some natural or political disaster, or a more gradual process of Mycenaean infiltration and eventual dominance, remains hotly debated. What is clear is that after 1450 BC, the Mycenaeans were the dominant power in the Aegean. They inherited the Minoan trade networks, and probably many of their contacts and commercial relationships. They adopted and adapted Minoan technologies and artistic styles, blending them with their own traditions to create a distinctive Mycenaean culture. And they expanded their reach beyond the Aegean, establishing trading posts and colonies in the eastern Mediterranean, raiding or trading with the great powers of the Near East, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the kingdoms of the Levant, New Kingdom Egypt. The question of Mycenaean warfare and military organization is a fascinating one. The Linear B tablets record quantities of bronze allocated for weapons, spearheads and arrowheads, swords and daggers, and they record chariots, those quintessential symbols of Bronze Age warfare. The tablets from Knossos record hundreds of chariots and their associated equipment, suggesting a substantial military force. But how the Mycenaeans actually fought, how they organized their armies, what tactics they used, remains largely a matter of inference and educated guesswork. The evidence from burials and from artistic representations suggests a warrior elite, equipped with bronze armor and weapons, fighting from chariots or on foot with spears and swords. The boar's tusk helmet, famously described in the Iliad, has been found in Mycenaean contexts, confirming that at least some of the details of Homeric warfare reflect Bronze Age reality. Large figure-of-8 shields, made of leather on a wooden frame, are depicted in frescoes and seal stones, and fragments of such shields have been found in archaeological contexts. Body armor included bronze cuirasses and greaves, and helmets of various types, some made of bronze, others of leather reinforced with bronze plates or boar's tusks. Chariots were prestige items, expensive to build and maintain, requiring trained horses and skilled drivers. They were probably used primarily as a means of rapid transport on the battlefield, carrying elite warriors to the point of combat where they would dismount to fight on foot, rather than as a platform for fighting from, as was the case in some Near Eastern armies. The flat plains of Boeotia and Thessaly, and the broad valleys of the Peloponnese, would have been suitable terrain for chariots, though the mountainous interior of Greece would have limited their usefulness. But the majority of Mycenaean warriors were probably infantry, armed with spears and shields, organized into contingents led by local lords or chiefs. The scale of warfare in the Mycenaean period is difficult to assess. The great fortifications suggest that major conflicts were possible, even expected. The tablets record deployments of troops to various locations, sometimes described as watchers or guards, suggesting a system of frontier defense or coastal patrols. And there are hints in the tablets of preparations for conflict, allocations of bronze for weapons, requisitions of food and supplies, movements of personnel. And then there is Troy. The question of whether the Trojan War actually happened, and if so, what it represented, has fascinated scholars and the public for more than a century. The site of Troy, Argolid in northwestern Turkey, was famously excavated by Schliemann in the 1870s, and excavations have continued intermittently ever since. The site shows multiple layers of occupation, spanning from the early Bronze Age through the Roman period. One of these layers, Troy VI, or Troy Siva depending on how you count, dates to the late Bronze Age, the Mycenaean period, and shows evidence of destruction around 1200 BC. Roughly the date that later Greek tradition assigned to the Trojan War. Troy was a wealthy city, strategically located near the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connects the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, and ultimately to the Black Sea. Control of this route would have been enormously valuable, allowing the collection of tolls or customs from ships passing through, and providing access to trade with the Black Sea region. The city was well fortified, with massive walls that still stand in places, and it shows evidence of contact with the Mycenaean world. Mycenaean pottery has been found at Troy, and there are other signs of trade or diplomatic relations. Whether the Greeks actually mounted a great expedition against Troy, whether there was a 10-year siege and a war involving heroes like Achilles and Hector, is impossible to say with certainty. The Iliad, our primary source for the story, was composed centuries after the Bronze Age, during the Archaic period, and it is a work of literature, not a historical chronicle. It contains many elements that are clearly poetic invention or mythological elaboration, but it also contains details about armor and weapons, about geography, about social structures that seem to reflect Bronze Age realities, suggesting that the poem preserves, however distorted, some memory of the Mycenaean world. Perhaps there was a war, or several wars, between Mycenaean Greeks and the people of Troy. Perhaps these conflicts were later conflated and magnified into the epic siege, remembered in tradition. Perhaps the story is pure invention, based on nothing more than the existence of ruins and a tradition of conflict. We will probably never know for certain, but the tradition itself is significant. The later Greeks believed that their ancestors had sailed to Troy, that the great heroes of the past had fought and died there, and that belief shaped how they understood their own history and identity. The end of the Mycenaean world came with shocking suddenness. Around 1200 BC, the palaces burned. Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were destroyed. Thebes may have been destroyed slightly earlier, around 1230 BC. Other sites were abandoned. The Linear B tablets cease. The palace administrations collapse. The elaborate trade networks that had connected the Aegean to the wider Mediterranean break down. Within a generation or two, the material culture of the Mycenaean world, the distinctive pottery, the monumental architecture, the rich burials, the literacy represented by Linear B, all disappear. Greece enters a dark age, a period of relative poverty and isolation that would last for several centuries. The collapse of Mycenaean civilization was not an isolated event. Around 1200 BC, the entire Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean suffered a catastrophic collapse. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia fell. Its capital Hattusa burned and abandoned. The cities of the Levant, Ugarit, Megiddo, Hazor, were destroyed. Egypt survived, but was weakened, fending off invasions by groups later Greek tradition would remember as the Sea Peoples. The great palace civilizations of the late Bronze Age, which had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, came to an end, and it would be several centuries before comparable levels of complexity and prosperity returned. The causes of this collapse have been much debated. There is no single explanation that accounts for everything. Climate change may have played a role. There is evidence for drought and crop failures in the eastern Mediterranean around this time, which could have led to food shortages, social unrest, and the breakdown of political order. Earthquakes may have destroyed some sites, though earthquakes alone cannot account for the widespread and more or less simultaneous collapse of so many different regions. Warfare and invasion clearly played a role. Many sites show evidence of destruction by fire, and there are references in Egyptian and Hittite texts to attacks by foreign peoples. But probably the collapse was not caused by any single factor, but by a combination of stresses, environmental, economic, political, that together overwhelmed the systems that had sustained Bronze Age civilization. The palace economies were complex and interdependent, relying on long-distance trade for essential raw materials like copper and tin. When those trade networks broke down, whether because of warfare or piracy or economic collapse in the regions that supplied the raw materials, the palaces could no longer function. Without bronze for tools and weapons, without the imported goods that signaled status and maintained the loyalty of followers, the power of the palace elites evaporated. Local systems of authority may have broken down as well, as populations migrated or fragmented, as crops failed and herds died, as the mechanisms of taxation and redistribution collapsed. In Greece, the collapse was followed by what historians call the Dark Age, or the Early Iron Age, a period lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 BC. Population declined sharply. Many sites were abandoned. The survivors clustered in a few defensible locations or dispersed into small agricultural communities. Trade diminished to a trickle. Writing vanished. The Linear B script, which had never been widely used beyond palace administration, was forgotten, and it would be more than 4 centuries before writing returned to Greece in the form of the alphabetic script, borrowed from the Phoenicians. Monumental architecture ceased. The elaborate pottery of the Mycenaean period was replaced by simpler handmade wares. Burial practices changed, with cremation becoming more common than the elaborate inhumations of the Bronze Age. And yet the Mycenaean world was not entirely forgotten. When writing returned to Greece and the Greeks began to compose literature, the great epics that emerged, the Iliad and the Odyssey, traditionally attributed to Homer, and the Theogonian works and days of Hesiod, were filled with references to an earlier age, an age of heroes and great kings, of palaces and citadels, of wars and adventures. These poems were composed in the 8th century BC, or perhaps a bit earlier, at least 400 years after the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, and they are clearly works of the imagination, shaped by the concerns and values of the archaic period. But they also preserve echoes of the Bronze Age, details of armor and weapons, descriptions of palaces and fortifications, names of places and peoples, that seem to derive ultimately from memories of the Mycenaean world. How were these memories preserved? Oral tradition is the most likely answer. Poetry and song, passed down from generation to generation, preserving stories and details, even as they were elaborated and changed. The bards of the Dark Age, the singers who performed at feasts and gatherings, inherited a tradition of song that went back to the Mycenaean period, and they kept that tradition alive, even as the world that had given birth to it vanished. By the time Homer composed the Iliad, probably in the 8th century BC, the poem had become a complex layering of different periods. Bronze Age details, mixed with Iron Age realities, Mycenaean customs blended with archaic practices, all woven together into a coherent if anachronistic whole. The Mycenaean Age became the Age of Heroes, the time when mortals walked with gods, when great kings ruled from mighty fortresses, when the greatest warriors of Greece sailed to Troy to fight a war that would echo through eternity. The ruins of the Mycenaean palaces became the settings for myths. Mycenaean, the city of Agamemnon, who led the Greeks to Troy. Pylos, the kingdom of wise old Nestor, oldest of the heroes, whose advice was sought by all Tyrrhens, associated with Heracles, the greatest of Greek heroes, whose labors took him to the ends of the earth. The tholos tombs, those great beehive chambers, were remembered as the treasuries of ancient kings, or as the tombs of heroes, or even as gateways to the underworld. The Greeks of the classical period looked back to the Mycenaean age with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. They could see the ruins, the great walls of Mycenaean Tyrrhens, the tholos tombs, the scattered traces of a vanished civilization. They knew the stories, the myths and legends that filled their literature and shaped their understanding of the past. But they had no real understanding of what the Mycenaean world had actually been like. They did not know that the Mycenaeans had written in Greek, that Linear B existed. They did not know the details of Mycenaean political organization or economy. They interpreted the ruins through the lens of their own myths, seeing in them confirmation of the stories they already knew. The rediscovery of the Mycenaean world is a modern achievement, the product of archaeology and scholarship over the past century and a half. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Mycenae and Troy in the 1870s were the beginning, dramatic and controversial, mixing genuine discoveries with dubious interpretations and unfortunate destructive practices. Schliemann was followed by others, Arthur Evans, who excavated Knossos and discovered the Minoan civilization, though he too mixed genuine scholarship with imaginative reconstruction. Alan Weiss, who worked at Mycenae and helped to establish the chronology and character of Mycenaean civilization. Carl Blegen, who excavated Pylos and discovered the palace and its archive of Linear B tablets. But the great breakthrough came in 1952, when Michael Ventris, working with the linguist John Chadwick, succeeded in deciphering Linear B and demonstrated that the language of the tablets was Greek. This discovery transformed our understanding of the Mycenaean world. For the first time, we could read the words of the Mycenaeans themselves, could see the names they used, the gods they worshipped, the administrative systems they employed. The decipherment of Linear B confirmed that the Mycenaeans were indeed Greeks, the ancestors of the classical Greeks, speakers of an early form of the same language that would be used by Homer and Herodotus, Plato and Aristotle. Since then, archaeology has continued to reveal new aspects of the Mycenaean world. Modern excavation techniques, combined with scientific methods like radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, isotope studies, and remote sensing, have allowed archaeologists to reconstruct Mycenaean life in ever greater detail. We can now map trade networks, trace the sources of raw materials, analyze diet and health, reconstruct climate and environment, identify kinship relations and migration patterns. New discoveries continue to be made. New tombs, new settlements, new tablets, each adding to our understanding. And yet, for all that we have learned, the Mycenaean world remains in many ways mysterious. The Linear B tablets tell us about palace administration, but little about politics or religion, about the beliefs and values that shaped Mycenaean society, about the inner lives of the people who lived in that distant age. The ruins tell us about the power and wealth of the elite, but much less about the lives of ordinary people, the farmers and herders, craftsmen and traders, who made up the bulk of the population. And the collapse remains a puzzle, a reminder of the fragility of civilization, of how quickly complexity and prosperity can give way to chaos and decline. The light over Mycenae is fading now, the sun dropping toward the western hills. The stones are still warm from the day's heat, but a cooler breeze is rising, carrying the scent of thyme and wild sage. The Lion Gate stands silent, the great stones unmoved by the passing of millennia. Down in the valley, the modern town of Mycenae is settling in for the evening. Lights beginning to appear in windows, the sound of voices and traffic drifting up the hillside. It is easy, standing here in the gathering dusk, to imagine the palace as it once was. The great Magorrhane, with its central hearth. The walls painted with frescoes. The king seated on his throne, receiving suppliants and dispensing justice. Warriors and nobles gathered for a feast, the bards singing of distant wars and ancient heroes. Easy to imagine the scribes in their archive rooms, carefully incising clay tablets, with records of sheep and grain, of offerings to the gods, of bronze allocated for weapons. Easy to imagine the craftsmen in their workshops, hammering bronze into armor and weapons, carving ivory into inlays, weaving textiles on great looms. Easy to imagine the women of the palace, dressed in elaborate costumes, moving through the courtyards, tending to their children, overseeing the work of the household. But these imaginings are just that. Imaginings, reconstructions based on fragments and probabilities, shaped as much by our own assumptions and desires as by the evidence itself. The Mycenaeans are gone, their voices silent, their thoughts and dreams lost. What remains are the stones, the artifacts, the tablets with their bureaucratic lists, and the myths, those extraordinary stories that preserve, however distorted, something of the world that was. The Mycenaeans were the first Greeks, the first people in this land, to speak the language that would become the language of Western civilization. The first to write Greek, the first to build kingdoms and palaces that would be remembered in legend and song. They were a warrior people, a trading people, a people who looked out across the Mediterranean and saw opportunity and wealth, who built great fortresses to protect what they had gained, who worshipped gods whose names are still familiar. They lived in a world that was connected and complex, a world of trade and diplomacy, of warfare and competition, a world that for all its differences from our own was recognizably human in its ambitions and its fears. And when that world ended, when the palaces burned and the kingdoms fell, when the great trade networks collapsed and the writing systems were forgotten, something survived. The memory survived, carried forward in oral tradition, in the songs of bards, in the stories told and retold around the hearth, until they became the myths that the later Greeks would recognize as the foundation of their own culture. The Mycenaean age became the age of heroes, the time when the greatest deeds were done, when mortals could still speak with gods, when the patterns of human destiny were set. The Mycenaeans left no literature, no philosophy, no political treatises. They left fortresses and tombs, pottery and weapons, tablets full of numbers and names. And yet, in a deeper sense, they left everything. They were the beginning of Greek civilization, the seed from which the classical world would grow, the ancestors whose deeds would inspire the poets and artists, the historians and playwrights who would create the culture that shaped the West. Without the Mycenaeans, there would have been no Homer, no Iliad or Odyssey. Without Homer, much of later Greek culture, the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, would have taken very different forms if they had existed at all. The stars are beginning to appear now, bright against the darkening sky. The ruins of Mycenae settle into shadow, the stones merging with the darkness of the hill. The Lion Gate is barely visible now, a darker mass against the dark hillside. Somewhere down in the valley, a dog barks, a car passes on the distant road. The modern world goes on, oblivious to the weight of the past, to the layers of history that lie beneath every landscape, every stone, every name. But the past is still here, if you know how to look for it. He says there, in the stones of Mycenae, in the gold masks and bronze weapons in the museum.
In the Linear B tablets with their lists and inventories.
It is there in the names of the gods, in the stories that are still told and retold, in the echoes of Bronze Age poetry that resonate through Homer and down to the present day. It is there in the landscape itself, in the valleys and hillsides, where Mycenaean farmers worked their fields and tended their flocks, in the harbors where Mycenaean ships once loaded and unloaded their cargoes, in the routes across the Aegean that still connect Greece to the wider world. The Mycenaeans built in stone, and their ruins endure. They made things of beauty and durability, and some of those things survive. They wrote on clay, and by accident of fire, some of their words can still be read. But most of what they were, their thoughts and fears, their joys and sorrows, their daily concerns and their deepest beliefs, is lost forever, beyond the reach of archaeology or scholarship. We can reconstruct the outlines of their world, but we cannot truly know them. They remain in the end, mysterious, distant inhabitants of a world that is gone beyond recovery. And yet they speak to us still, these first Greeks, across the gulf of 3,000 years. They speak in the ruins of their palaces, in the artifacts they left behind, in the myths that preserve their memory. They speak of a time when the world was younger, when kingdoms rose and fell, when heroes walked the earth and gods still intervened in human affairs. They speak of ambition and achievement, of the heights that human civilization can reach, and the depths to which it can fall. They speak of the fragility of all human endeavor, of how even the mightiest fortress and the richest kingdom can be reduced to rubble and dust, can be forgotten by all but archaeologists and scholars, can become merely a setting for myths and legends. But they also speak of continuity, of how the past shapes the present, of how the deeds of the ancestors, however distant, continue to resonate through time. The Mycenaeans were the beginning, the first Greeks, the founders of a tradition that would eventually give rise to democracy and philosophy, to tragedy and comedy, to history and science, to much of what we recognize as the foundation of Western civilization. They did not know what they were beginning. They could not have imagined the world that would eventually grow from the seeds they planted. They lived their lives, built their palaces, fought their wars, worshipped their gods, and died, and the world moved on. But something remained, something endured. The Greek language survived, evolving and changing, but never quite disappearing, carrying forward words and concepts and ways of thinking from the Mycenaean age into the classical period and beyond. The gods survived, their names and some of their attributes preserved through the Dark Age to be worshipped again in the temples of the archaic and classical periods. The myths survived, the stories of heroes and kings, of Troy and Thebes, of Heracles and Perseus and Theseus, stories that would be told and retold, written and rewritten, for thousands of years to come. And the memory survived, the sense that there had been an earlier age, a time of heroes and great deeds, a time when the world was different, when the gods were closer, when human potential seemed unlimited. That memory, however distorted and idealized, shaped how the later Greeks understood themselves, gave them a sense of continuity with the past, connected them to their ancestors and to the land they inhabited. It made them Greeks, not just in language, but in culture and identity, part of a tradition that stretched back into the mists of the Bronze Age, back to Mycenae and the Age of Heroes. The night is fully dark now. The ruins of Mycenae are invisible, lost in shadow. Only the stars remain, the same stars that the Mycenaeans would have seen, the same constellations that guided their ships across the Mediterranean, that marked the seasons for their farmers, that figured in their myths and stories. The wind has died down, and the night is still and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls, a sound that echoes across the valley and fades into silence. The Mycenaeans are gone, but their world is still here, buried beneath the earth, encoded in the landscape, preserved in fragments and traces that we can still read and interpret. They are still here in the stones and the stories, in the gold and the bronze, in the tablets and the tombs. They are still here in the language we use to describe them, in the myths that they helped to create, in the sense of continuity that connects us, however tenuously, to that distant Bronze Age world. They were the first Greeks, and in a sense they are still with us, their presence felt in every aspect of Greek culture, in every echo of the Homeric poems, in every archaeological discovery that brings their world a little more clearly into focus. To stand at Mycenae is to stand at the beginning, at the source, at the place where Greek civilization first took recognizable form. It is to stand in the presence of the past, to feel the weight of 3,000 years of history, to sense, however imperfectly, the lives of the people who built these walls and lived within them. It is to be reminded of the impermanence of all human achievement, of how even the greatest civilizations can fall, can be forgotten, can be reduced to ruins and legends. But it is also to be reminded of the persistence of memory, of how the past continues to shape the present, of how the deeds of the ancestors, however distant, continue to echo through time. The Mycenaeans built their world with bronze and stone, with muscle and will, with ambition and belief. They created a civilization that lasted for centuries, that reached across the Mediterranean, that left its mark on the landscape and the imagination. And when that world ended, when the palaces burned and the kingdoms fell, they left behind something more enduring than bronze or stone. They left a legacy, a tradition, a sense of who they had been that would be carried forward by their descendants, that would shape the culture of the Greeks for 1,000 years and more. That legacy lives on, in the ruins that still stand, in the artifacts that fill our museums, in the tablets that we can still read, in the myths and stories that continue to be told, in the language that evolved from Mycenaean Greek into the Greek of Homer, of Plato, of the modern Greek people, in the sense of continuity that connects us, across the gulf of 3 millennia, to those distant ancestors, the first Greeks, the Mycenaeans of the Bronze Age. The wind stirs again, moving across the hilltop, carrying with it the scent of the Mediterranean, of thyme and sage and dry earth. The stars wheel overhead, marking the passage of time as they have for countless generations. And Mycenae endures, silent and dark, waiting for the dawn, waiting to tell its story once more to those who come to listen, to learn, to remember.